September 1st, 1939. The German-Polish border. The first light of dawn bled across the Polish countryside, illuminating a sight the world had never seen. It began not with an artillery barrage, but with a low droning hum that grew into a thunderous roar. The sky turned black, not with clouds, but with aircraft. Hundreds of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, their gull wings and fixed landing gears giving them a predatory, archaic look, descended like birds of prey. They unleashed a new kind of warfare, a symphony of terror written in screaming sirens and high explosive bombs. Behind them came the panzers, not the slow lumbering beasts of the last war, but fast, agile machines that sliced through defensive lines, bypassing strong points, and sowed chaos in the rear. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war. And in that first month of September 1939, Germany did not just invade Poland, it announced a revolution in military affairs. The world, still thinking in terms of trenches and static fronts, was about to be taught a brutal, unforgiving lesson by a nation that had spent the last 6 years in a fever dream of rearmament and strategic innovation. The rise of Germany as a global power in World War II was not an accident of history. It was the terrifying culmination of a perfect storm, a unique and volatile mixture of geopolitical opportunity, ideological fervor, economic mobilization, technological innovation, and military doctrine that, for a few brief years, made the Wehrmacht the most formidable fighting force on the planet. To understand how a nation shackled by the Treaty of Versailles just 2 decades prior could bring a continent to its knees is to dissect the very anatomy of modern power. The geopolitical crucible, exploiting a world in chaos. Germany's ascent began in the vacuum of the interwar years. The Treaty of Versailles, designed to cripple Germany permanently, had instead created a nation seething with resentment and a burning desire for revision. The Great Depression of 1929 shattered the fragile stability of the Weimar Republic and discredited the democratic powers, Britain, France, and the United States, who seemed weak, divided, and indecisive. Into this power vacuum stepped Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, offering a potent cocktail of national restoration, racial purity, and militant action. Hitler possessed an uncanny, if cynical, understanding of his adversary's weaknesses. He correctly gauged that the trauma of World War I had instilled a profound pacifism in Britain and France. Their policy of appeasement was not mere cowardice. It was a desperate attempt to avoid another catastrophic war at almost any cost. Hitler exploited this relentlessly. He remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, a direct violation of Versailles, calling the Allies bluff. He annexed Austria in the Anschluss of 1938, again meeting with verbal condemnation but no action. The crowning achievement of this strategy was the Munich Agreement of 1938, where Britain and France, desperate for peace in our time, forced Czechoslovakia to surrender the Sudetenland, its defensible mountainous border, to the Reich. With each successful gamble, Hitler grew bolder, and the perception of German invincibility grew. Furthermore, Germany skillfully manipulated the larger geopolitical chessboard. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 was a masterstroke of realpolitik. This non-aggression treaty with the Soviet Union, ideological arch-enemies, ensured Germany would not face a two-front war immediately. It divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and most crucially, guaranteed the flow of Soviet raw materials, oil, grain, and iron that would fuel the initial blitzkrieg campaigns. This pact temporarily neutralized the colossal Soviet land army and allowed Germany to concentrate its entire might against a weak West. They had successfully isolated Poland and convinced Stalin to become a temporary accomplice, all while the democracies slept, walked towards a conflict they were not prepared to fight. The Ideological Engine. The Volksgemeinschaft and total war power, however, is more than just strategic cunning. The Third Reich was powered by an ideology that was both its greatest strength and its ultimate fatal flaw. The concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, was a powerful unifying force. It promised to tear down old class barriers and unite all Aryan Germans in a national project of renewal. This was not an empty promise. The regime quickly ended mass unemployment through massive public works programs like the Autobahns, and most significantly, a breakneck, clandestine rearmament drive. For many Germans, the Nazis delivered prosperity, pride, and a sense of purpose after the humiliating years of the Weimar Republic. This ideological fervor was weaponized. The Nazi state was engineered for conflict from its very core. Its doctrine was not merely one of war, but of total war, the complete subordination of the economy, society, and culture to the needs of the military. This was a level of societal mobilization that the democratic, capitalist West was initially unwilling and unable to match. The German education system indoctrinated youth in the Hitler Youth and League of German Girls, glorifying militarism, sacrifice, and obedience. Propaganda, masterfully orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, saturated every aspect of life, portraying Hitler as the infallible genius and Germany as a nation surrounded by jealous enemies, justifying any and all actions as necessary for survival. This ideology also created a fighting force of terrifying commitment. The German soldier, the Lanzer, was often not a political Nazi, but he was deeply imbued with a sense of national duty and technical proficiency. More importantly, the ideology of racial superiority provided a moral carte blanche for unspeakable brutality. The wars in Eastern Europe were conceived from the start as wars of annihilation, Vernichtungskrieg, against what were deemed subhuman Slavic peoples and Judeo-Bolshevism. This ideological framework erased the rules of war. It enabled the Einsatzgruppen, death squads, that followed the army, the deliberate starvation of millions of Soviet POWs, and the industrial horror of the Holocaust. This ruthless calculus, while a moral abyss, provided a short-term military advantage. It was a war without restraint, fought with a chilling efficiency that stunned its victims. The economic miracle, guns before butter. Behind the marching columns and diving Stukas lay an economic engine that had been secretly rebuilt and ruthlessly optimized for war. While the Western democracies were still struggling with peacetime economies in the late 1930s, Germany had been on a war footing for years. The man behind this was Hjalmar Schacht, and later, the brutal architect of slave labor, Albert Speer. Under the four-year plan, the German economy was directed towards one goal: military self-sufficiency or autarky. The results were staggering. Between 1933 and 1939, German steel production doubled, aluminum production, critical for aircraft, increased sevenfold, and military spending skyrocketed to over 20% of GNP by 1938, a figure far exceeding that of Britain or France. German industry, particularly giants like Krupp, IG Farben, and Messerschmitt, worked in close symbiotic partnership with the state, developing and producing the tools of war with relentless focus. They pioneered new manufacturing techniques and designed weapons not for cost-effectiveness, but for maximum tactical performance. This economic mobilization was built on a pyramid of plunder and slavery. First, it was funded by the systematic looting of the German state, seizing the assets of Jews, political opponents, and conquered territories. Second, and most critically, it ran on slave labor. Millions of people from occupied Europe, Poles, Soviets, French, were shipped to Germany to work in factories, mines, and fields. Concentration camp inmates became a disposable commodity for corporations like Siemens and Volkswagen. This vast pool of forced labor freed German men for the front and kept the war machine running long after its own human resources had been exhausted. It was an economy built on a foundation of atrocity, but it was devastatingly effective in the short term, giving the Wehrmacht a qualitative and quantitative edge in the early years of the war. The technological edge, quality over quantity. German military power was synonymous with technological innovation. While the Allies often favored simplicity and mass production, German engineers pursued a philosophy of technical excellence and complexity, producing some of the most advanced and feared weapons of the war. In the air, the Luftwaffe was not the largest air force, but it was arguably the most sophisticated and battle-hardened in 1939 to 40. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was one of the world's premier fighters. The Junkers Ju-88 was a versatile and fast medium bomber, but it was the tactical application of air power that was truly revolutionary. The Stuka was more than a plane. It was a psychological weapon, its screaming siren becoming the soundtrack of blitzkrieg. The Luftwaffe functioned as flying artillery, working in intimate concert with the fast-moving panzer divisions to shatter enemy formations. On the ground, the panzer divisions were the spearhead of the blitzkrieg. While not always possessing the best tanks in the early war, the Panzer I and II were light and undergunned. The Germans perfected their use. They concentrated their armor into powerful, independent fists that could punch through enemy lines and then run rampant in the rear, disrupting communications, supplies, and command structures. They also developed revolutionary command and control systems, notably the widespread use of radio in every tank, which gave them a flexibility and responsiveness that their opponents lacked. As the war progressed, this commitment to technological wonder weapons, or Wunderwaffe, continued. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket were the first cruise and ballistic missiles, terrorizing London and pointing to the future of warfare. The Messerschmitt Me-2 62 was the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine so advanced it could run circles around Allied prop planes. The Type 21 U-boat was a revolutionary submarine that could have decimated Atlantic convoys if produced in time. This technological prowess forced the Allies to constantly innovate in response and demonstrated a capacity for engineering that was and remains awe-inspiring. The military doctrine, Auftrags tactic, and the cult of the offensive. Finally, the glue that bound all these elements together was a unique and superior military doctrine. The German army operated on the principle of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. Unlike the rigid top-down command structures of the French or Soviet armies, Auftragstaktik gave junior officers, even NCOS, a high degree of autonomy. A commander would define the goal of a mission, but not prescribe how to achieve it. It was the responsibility of the junior leader on the ground to use his initiative, assess the changing tactical situation, and figure out how to accomplish the mission. This created an army that was incredibly flexible, resilient, and fast-moving. It could react to battlefield surprises and exploit fleeting opportunities in a way its opponents could not. It fostered a culture of aggression, innovation, and personal responsibility that produced a generation of brilliant battlefield commanders like Erwin Rommel and Heinz Guderian. This doctrine, combined with the offensive spirit of Blitzkrieg, gave the Wehrmacht a decisive edge in the early war of movement phases of the conflict. They were not just fighting with better weapons, they were fighting a different, more modern kind of war. For a brief, terrifying period, from the fall of Poland in 1939 to the gates of Moscow in late 1941, Germany was the dominant global power. It was a dominance built on a foundation of audacity, innovation, and ruthless efficiency. But it was also a house built on sand. Its economic model was unsustainable without constant conquest. Its ideological fanaticism alienated potential allies and justified a war of annihilation that guaranteed a fight to the death. Its reliance on technological overcomplexity eventually buckled under the sheer, overwhelming weight of Allied mass production. And its initial tactical brilliance could not forever compensate for the fundamental strategic error of engaging in a multi-front war against a coalition of nations that collectively possessed vastly greater resources, industrial capacity, and ultimately staying power. The story of Germany's power in World War II is therefore a cautionary tale of how a nation can reach the pinnacle of military might through a combination of skill and savagery, only to discover that such a foundation cannot support the weight of its own ambition. The human capital, the officer corps, and the veteran corps. Beneath the ideology and the technology lay the most crucial element of all, the quality of the German soldier, and just as importantly, his leaders. The Reichswehr, the 100,000-man army permitted by the Treaty of Versailles, had been deliberately designed as a cadre force. It was not an army of conscripts, but a professional corps of the most talented officers and senior non-commissioned officers. Every single man is a potential instructor, a future leader of a company, a battalion, a division. This meant that when Hitler began his rapid expansion, he had a deep bench of superbly trained, highly experienced professionals to form the backbone of the new Wehrmacht. This corps of veterans from the Reichswehr instilled a level of professionalism and tactical skill that was unmatched in 1939. Furthermore, many of these men had fought in the First World War. They understood the realities of combat, the importance of logistics, and the necessity of combined arms warfare in a way that the greener armies of France and Britain did not. This created a formidable brain trust for the German military, a repository of institutional knowledge and practical experience that was seamlessly transferred to the new massive conscript army. The junior lieutenant leading a Panzer Grenadier platoon in 1940 was often trained by a sergeant major who had fought at Verdun, creating a direct lineage of hard-won, practical knowledge that flowed through the ranks. The psychological dimension, the cult of decisive battle. German military philosophy, heavily influenced by the 19th century thinker Karl von Clausewitz, was obsessed with the concept of the Vernichtungsschlacht, the battle of annihilation. The ultimate goal of any campaign was not merely to defeat the enemy army, but to encircle and destroy it utterly, thereby breaking the enemy nation's will to fight in one swift, catastrophic blow. This philosophy permeated every level of command, from Hitler's grand strategy down to a battalion commander's tactical decisions. It was a philosophy of the offensive, of relentless movement, of seeking out the enemy's center of gravity and shattering it. This stood in stark contrast to the more defensive, attritional mindset that had taken hold in France, which had invested its faith and its treasury in the static, defensive Maginot Line. The German obsession with the decisive battle created a self-reinforcing cycle of aggression. Early, stunning successes in Poland and France, the very models of Vernichtungsschlacht, convinced the German high command of the invincibility of their doctrine. This bred a dangerous overconfidence, but in the early war, it provided an unstoppable momentum. The enemy was not just being beaten, they were being psychologically overwhelmed by the speed, violence, and totality of their defeat. The fall of France in just 6 weeks was less a mere military victory and more a profound psychological collapse induced by the relentless application of this doctrine. Logistical innovation and adaptation. Blitzkrieg was not just about tanks and planes. It was about supply and movement. The German military displayed a remarkable, though often improvised, talent for logistics that kept their fast-moving armies fueled and armed. They mastered the use of airborne supply, airdropping fuel and ammunition to forward panzer units when truck columns couldn't keep up. They became experts at utilizing captured equipment, famously pressing French lorries and Czech tanks into service to supplement their own production, a pragmatic approach that helped offset their industrial shortcomings. The German infantry, while often reliant on horse-drawn transport for heavier supplies, was trained to live off the land and move with a speed that continually surprised their opponents. This logistical flexibility was a key force multiplier. It allowed an army with fewer trucks and a less robust industrial base than its enemies to achieve stunning operational-level successes. They understood that a campaign was a race between their own operational tempo and the enemy's ability to react. By pushing their logistics to the absolute limit and beyond, they consistently won that race in the years 1939 to 1941. This ability to maintain the momentum of an offensive, to keep the pressure on a shattered enemy without pause, was a hallmark of German operations and a testament to their skill in the operational art of war. The weaknesses inherent in the strength. Yet, within each pillar of German strength lay the seed of its eventual destruction. The ideological fanaticism that created a relentless fighting force also led to strategic blindness. The deep-seated Nazi contempt for Slavic Untermenschen, subhumans, ensured that the war in the East would be one of unparalleled brutality, which in turn guaranteed a ferocious partisan resistance and a Soviet will to fight that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. There would be no negotiated peace with an enemy you have vowed to exterminate. The same ideology led to the persecution and expulsion of some of Germany's brightest scientific minds, many of whom were Jewish, who then took their talents to the Allied cause, most notably in the Manhattan Project. The economic model for all its initial success was a pyramid scheme built on plunder. It was not structured for a long war of attrition against the combined industrial might of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. The focus on complex, high-quality weapons like the Tiger tank or the Me-262 jet fighter meant they could never match the sheer volume of output from American factories producing robust, simpler designs like the T-34 tank or the P-51 Mustang. German industry, for all its technical prowess, was eventually drowned in a flood of Allied steel. The military doctrine of Auftragstaktik, while brilliant at the tactical level, could create chaos at the strategic level, especially when combined with a command structure riven by personal rivalries and a Führer who increasingly micromanaged operations from his wolf's lair, often against the advice of his professional generals. The very aggression that served them so well in the early war became a liability later on, leading to catastrophic overextension, most famously at Stalingrad and in the Ardennes Offensive of 1944. In the final analysis, Germany's period of global power was a fleeting, violent explosion of national energy. It was the product of a society that had been honed into a single, sharp instrument of war. For a time, that instrument was the finest in the world. But the very forces that created it, the totalitarian control, the ideological hatred, the cult of the offensive, made it incapable of the strategic patience, diplomatic flexibility, and economic sustainability required to win a prolonged global conflict. They mastered the art